psychodynamic approach. That starts out with a person that you're familiar with called Sigmund Freud. But essentially, the school of thought as a whole attempts to explain personality, motivation, and underlying problems with psychopathology, which is to say, the stuff we'll cover in Abnormal Psychology chapter. We're all part of this unconscious process that you have a universe in yourself, so to speak. Metaphorically, you are a world unto yourself, and most of it, you're not aware of it. It's operating unconsciously, which is a very strange concept. So that's what's driving your experiences. Sigmund Freud gets him a little asterisk. We'll get back to Sigmund Freud when we talk about personality. When we get to the personality chapter, we'll go into some of the aspects of what he considered to be essential functions of personality development, essential stages of personality development, and how that produced an individual at the end of the process that was relatively entrenched in who they were. So he, as an Austrian physician, founding the school, made up a theory that you got to take Sigmund Freud with a grain of salt. He was a racist misogynist. Right? He didn't like women, and it comes out pretty strong in his theory. And then when I say he didn't like them, he was just a patriarchal dude like most of them, and a white one at that. He thought that women were not the equivalent of men. They were lesser than. So they had more problems because they were inherently inferior. He said all of us have problems, so he wasn't putting men way up there, but he wasn't kind in his theorizing. But if you look at the times when he existed, it fell right in line with most of the dominant thinking of the time. So that if he saw women as patients, that was kind of what he expected to see, because the men were still put together. And they weren't really put together. As we can see, people all have internal conflicts and they all have external conflicts. But the women who sought him out were middle-class Viennese women who, to say that they had leisure time to seek out a physician, they had money to go do it, and they would go sit in this man's office on his couch, and they would talk to him about problems they were having, and then he would theorize why they had this problem, the psychopathology, and he undergirded that with a whole theory of personality. When I say he made it up, I don't mean that he just did it willy-nilly. This is one very thorough person. If you read his stuff, you will be stunned and amazed. Read his lectures when he came to America. You read that stuff and you're thinking, oh yes, but this. That's what you're thinking. And then, by golly, the next sentence is, you're probably thinking this. And he'll answer that criticism. And he's so thorough that everything you can think up as a counter argument to him, it seems like he's addressed it. The problem with it really is it doesn't lend itself to operationalization. You can't really define it in terms that are easy to measure. So you've got this really fancy sounding theory that seems to encompass all of human experience, but you can't test it. And if you know anything about scientific method and theorizing in the scientific paradigm, you need to be able to test your theories before you have any kind of confidence that they're valid. And he didn't do that. He was not a researcher. And he was very much entrenched in his own paradigms of his time. And that's his daughter, Anna Freud, who, ironically, being female, became world famous as a child psychoanalyst. She contributed a lot and added on to his theories and modified some of his theories. So his own daughter was a little bit of an exception to him. But what he's suggesting is we're not masters of our mind. We'd like to think we're masters of our mind. We delude ourselves from Freud's point of view into thinking that we are making our own fate, so to speak. But he says, really, what's driving your behavior on a moment-to-moment basis is not what you think is happening, but an unconscious and subconscious mind that you developed when you were an infant. So that when you were in your mother's arms or your surrogate mother's arms as a baby, your personality was being imprinted upon you in those experiences. And that as you go through toddlerhood, pre-adolescence, and adolescence, you are stamped into who you become in a way that is so entrenched that you're not even aware of it, so therefore you don't have a whole lot of chance to change it. He'd be happy to see you in psychoanalysis as many days a week as you could afford to go for as many years as you'd like to go there, but he didn't hold out a lot of hope that you were going to change, because in his mind, your mind that's driving your experience is largely unconscious. He's onto that as a notion, and in fact, unconsciousness does seem to be empirically verifiable in some ways. But it's a hard thing for most people to grasp. And he's saying your most primitive urges and drives, right? Sex, power, aggression, wanting what you want because you want it, are what's really motivating you. But you can't express that openly in society for fear that society will put you in check. And so you then push all that down into the unconscious. It's still there. it's still operating, but it comes out in ways that have been adapted to fit society. And you're not being aware of it means that you then, for him, invent rationale for what you do. So he is a determinist. And the psychoanalytic theories are saying that you are determined early on in life to do certain things later in life. Your early experiences then drive your later behavior. But you not being aware of them means you're not in a position to really explore them or to change them that much. And that's a hard thing for a lot of people to swallow. And I would say that's probably one of Freud's biggest contributions is he pissed people off. People were like, you're a crazy man. Why would you say these things? He's talking about infant sexuality and stuff that people had said. You didn't even talk about sexuality back in those days. And he's talking about it. So some people were just horrified by the things he suggested, and they went and started doing research to prove him wrong. Other people read him and thought, this man's a genius. He's on to things that nobody's ever considered before, and they seem valid to us, and they went and did research to prove him right. So what you see is a person so controversial, but yet so thorough that he's believable on the surface, spurring on the science of psychology with people in his camp and people outside his camp trying to prove him right or prove him wrong. And so in that sense, he moved us forward in big ways. And he's very controversial. And that is a thing that still stands with us today. You could read Freud today and it's still relevant. It still makes sense. In fact, I would encourage you to read some. It's interesting. It's fascinating. But you're not probably going to read it and go, oh yeah, that's exactly the way I would have thought about it. Because we have all this history of research in psychology since him that has given us much more firm footing based in empirical foundations than what he was trying to get at without the benefit of the scientific method or any kind of research that was formal in any straightforward way. This brings us to behaviorism. Behaviorism now is a reaction in some ways. As we'll see, John Watson starts it off. But looking at structuralism and consciousness, want to model it after the hard sciences, then what do you want? You want hard data. But introspection for behaviorists isn't hard data. It's asking you what you feel, what you think, what you perceive, what your emotional processes, what are your mental processes. And then you go over to functionalism. Essentially, they're dealing with the same territory without any more additional empirical verification. Then you've got psychoanalysis saying, well, it's all inside you and unconscious, and in your deep, deep subconscious and unconscious mind. We can't get to that even using introspection. So for the behaviorists, they said, you know what? That all smacks of non-scientific inquiry to us. We want to be scientific. We want to be empirical. Well, what can we do? We can measure behavior. Behavior is objective. Behavior occurs in a way that we could get a number of people together to define operationally what we might call a behavior, and then we can all observe it and agree or disagree whether we saw it or not. All right, we can get multiple observers, we get single observers, but one thing is for sure, behavior either occurs or it doesn't occur. And it's measurable. Intensity, frequency, duration, those are properties that we can measure behavior within, and this school asserts that behavior is governed by stimuli, detectable inputs, what stimulus is. Anything in your environment that you can perceive is a stimulus. In fact, you could have internal stimuli, right? If your stomach starts growling, that's an internal stimulus to tell you you're hungry, right? That would then drive your behavior to seek out food. The behaviorists are rather strict in their interpretation, which is also determinist, that the stimuli in your environment prompt responses, which then bring about consequences that make it more or less likely that you'll do the same kind of behavior in similar situations in the future, or that you'll be less likely to do the same kind of behavior in similar situations in the future. And in that sense, it's also known as stimulus-response psychology in old school terms. Now that's another radical notion because people don't like that idea. They don't say, I'm not a rat in a cage. You can't just feed me a piece of cheese and I do whatever. But in a way, we do respond similarly to lower animals. John Watson showed us this with a couple of studies that are classics, one of which we'll go over, the Little Albert study. Father of behaviorism. Right? Thought it was unworthy to study consciousness because you can't see it. I can't weigh it. I can't put it on a table. I can't get at that except through some subjective interpretation you're having about your consciousness, which you then relate to me. So he thought it was a flawed method. It's unobservable. I'm just getting subjective reports. I want to study behavior because it can be measured in a verifiable manner. Thus, it's hard data. Thus, it emulates the harder sciences. And thus, we have a firm footing for what he considered to be scientific inquiry, right? There's a picture. Ain't he a smooth-looking cat? Yeah. There's him hugging Rosalie Rayner. And we find out that he was forced to resign from Johns Hopkins in 1920 because he had an affair with his grad student, Rosalie Rayner. He was actually married at the time, and he started playing around on the side. He's got a reputation for being a ladies' man. He is a suave-looking dude, right? Apparently, he's a smooth operator, too. He married Rosalie, got basically booted out of psychology because of his behavior. Right? Irony of all ironies, right? A man who studies behavior can't continue to study behavior because of his behavior. So he has to go on, and he takes that pretty well, uses his knowledge of psychology, goes into advertising and makes a fortune. So if you're interested in advertising, mass comm, marketing, and things like that, you should consider psychology as a major or a minor because it's relevant. It's very, very relevant. He's another controversial theorist, and somebody else comes along somewhat even more controversial than him because he was in the business so much longer. It's still the basis of many educational and treatment practices. If you look at the best treatment for autism, it's almost 24/7 applied behavior analysis. If you can afford that, and most can't, or get access to it, and most can't get access to it, you see remarkable outcomes. In some cases, it looks as though it's almost cured. Applied behavior analysis is very, very practical in certain kinds of settings. Working with people with mental retardation, working with any children in a learning environment. So if you are going to be a teacher, learning the learning principles will help you tremendously in managing the behavior in your classroom so that learning is more likely to be accomplished. It got a big boost from a guy named Ivan Pavlov, whom we're going to talk about when we get into that chapter. He trained dogs to salivate to sounds. Bing! Slobber dog. Bing! Slobber dog. You should go as a critical thinker or a developing critical thinker. Well, who cares about some slobbering dogs? And I'm going to give you some reasons to care about slobbering dogs because it has major implications on all kinds of other issues, not the least of which are how you acquire taste aversions. You ever have that thing where you can't hardly stand to smell a particular kind of food because you got sick on it before, right? Or you have the experience of some phobias, or you have the problem of drug abuse, because that little slobbering dog is relevant to all of that stuff in ways that you may not see readily on the surface. But it triggered a lot of animal research, and not everybody's okay with animal research. And if you're not okay with animal research, I'm okay with that. I would just say as a caveat, keep in mind that almost every medical procedure from which we all benefit, if you've got grandparents or parents or siblings or yourself or friends who've ever benefited from some medical procedure, we do have animals to thank for that. They went through some tough times to advance our medical knowledge, and we now have an ethics board that governs animal research so that they minimize suffering, but that ain't to say that they alleviate it. And so some people are very, very passionate that animal research shouldn't be done. I can respect that. On the other side, I see the benefits of the science that uses animals, in the past at least, to bring us knowledge that's relevant today in ways that are very important. So B.F. Skinner got him a little asterisk, as did John Watson, because he's another behaviorist. He's a huge name. One of my favorites. Very misunderstood, very controversial, mostly because he's misunderstood. But not only that, he wasn't really doing much to endear himself to the public in terms of translating his ideas. He did try to do that. He actually wrote a novel based on some of the principles he discovered called Walden 2. If you ever get a chance to read Walden 2, that's a very interesting novel. You may or may not agree with some of the stuff you read in there. But he has a debate actually going on about whether this is worth doing. He has another thing called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Beyond Freedom and Dignity. People like freedom and dignity. I don't know that we want to go beyond it. A lot of people have problems with those concepts, and I understand that. I do to myself to some degree. He emphasized the environmental factors in determining behavior, such that perhaps it's the environment that you see people in that's actually determining their behavior, on the job, in the school, in the house. right? It's the stuff that goes on around them that drives their behavior more than a choice of their own free will. In fact, the behaviorists don't really think much of free will any more than the psychoanalysts. They think that you're really a product of a learning history. There's old B.F. Skinner right there, and he demonstrated empirically Thorndike's law of effect. Ed Thorndike said organisms tend to repeat responses that lead to positive outcomes, but they don't tend to repeat responses that lead to negative or neutral outcomes. And that sounds like, duh, come on, that's common sense, right? Sure, it does seem that way, but it was common sense that the sun went around the earth for the longest of times, right? Until we got data to show pretty convincingly that that's not the case. So you need the same kind of data to prove that it is the case. In this case, that's right. But the ways in which you break that down and pull it apart gave us some valuable insights into understanding things like absenteeism at work. Why are people here on some days and not on other days, right? Why people might engage in illegal activities when clearly they're not to their best interest or don't appear to be to other members of society. Why people raise children in certain ways in one family and in other ways in another family. Things that are actually very important to us as human beings can be better understood through breaking down the behavioral laws that we would say he came up with, or behavioral theories. Very controversial theory, as he illustrated that behavior is governed by external stimuli. Free will to him is an illusion, and so for him, you're really looking at positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment, learning experiences that start when you're a child that accumulate over your entire lifetime so that we could predict with fair accuracy on an individual basis whether somebody's going to go to a class or not go to a class on any given day based on their learning history, where they feel like it was a choice that they did or they didn't on that given day. Skinner would say it was probably just part of their learning history that could predict pretty easily the probability whether they would or wouldn't go to class on a certain day. So instead of just picking apart people characterologically, he looked at the behavior and how it functioned in the environment to better understand human motivation. That, again, bothers some people.